Good afternoon and welcome to Axia Public Relations webinar. We're very excited that you're all here today. Thank you for joining us. Today we're talking about spokesperson training. I am your host, Jason Mudd. I'm CEO of Axia Public Relations. We welcome you and thank you for being on our live webinar today. We are encouraging you to ask any questions throughout the entire webinar that you might have. You can tweet them to us on Twitter using @AxiaPR with the hashtag PR training. Or if it's more convenient for you, please go ahead and go into the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel and just post your questions to us right there. That'll probably be the easiest way for you to interface with us. We will answer any question you ask. There are no such thing as dumb questions. We have found that if you have a question, someone else probably does too. So go ahead and feel free to ask as many questions as you'd like throughout the webinar. We are going to answer many of them through the chat functionality. But when we sense a question that we think is relevant to the entire audience, we're also going to answer those during the live webinar today. Don't worry, we won't use your company name or your last name when we address your question publicly. So real quick, let's get started. I am Jason Mudd, the founder and CEO of Axia Public Relations. Here's a few bullet points about me. A quick highlight is that I used to work in journalism and then decided that I wanted to get on the agenda setting side of news instead of reporting other people's news. So I quickly switched career paths into public relations and saw the opportunity to be more strategic and to have a greater influence on the decisions that are being made by my clients and corporations. And I've never looked back since. So I've had the honor of working with some terrific clients over the years and look forward to an opportunity to help you should you have any needs for spokesperson training or public relations. Real quick, our company is Axia Public Relations. We are, of course, a public relations firm. We specialize in building strong brands and great reputations through earning media coverage for our clients, reputation management, social media, blogging, spokesperson training, thought leadership, speaking, awards, and recognition. We also offer inbound marketing and content marketing programs for our clients. A quick disclaimer, we are recording this webinar for promotional purposes. We own all copyrights and we are not providing legal guidance in our recommendations and tips here. If you need legal guidance, we encourage you to seek legal counsel and hire a qualified attorney to give you that guidance. Today's objectives. The objective for the webinar is to prepare your company and its executives for news media interviews. So today we are focusing on how to prepare your company and your executives for interviewing with the news media. Why is it important? Because you never know when you'll need it. This is an example of a chemical spill, and you just never know when things are going to go bad and when your company is going to need to put its best foot forward. But most importantly, you should always be looking to put your best foot forward and always be looking to conduct every news interview as best as you possibly can. In fact, 5,000 American CEOs talked to Impulse Research about media training, and 9 in 10 of them have had media training in the past. 84% say media interviews are the most effective way to get the company's message across. 80% say media training is valuable, and they said that their presidents and division heads should also receive the media training. So from the top down, there's support for media training. I have met many CEOs who say they don't need to be media trained. I've met other executives who say they've been media trained before. But almost always, eventually, they all come back and confess that they need some reminders and a fresh start, and need to be trained again. So that's why we're presenting this content to you today, an opportunity to help others figure out the best way to be prepared for media interviews. So what you're going to learn today by participating in our webinar is you're going to understand what effective interviewing is. And there's 3 steps to effective interviewing. The first one is know the person you're talking to, know your key messages, and thirdly, know how to communicate those messages effectively. Without that, you're really heading into a media interview blind. So write these tips down. We're going to give you several tips throughout this webinar. So I would take a moment and get something to write with. I guarantee you'll have at least 1 or 2 pages of notes to take back with you. And I would encourage you to take those back, review them with your team, and certainly call on us if you ever find yourself in need of a public relations resource. So our agenda today. First of all, I want to clarify, and I'm going to do that right now, the difference between spokesperson training and speaker training. We get a lot of inquiries at our PR firm from people looking for spokesperson training, but once you start talking to them, they really want to create a public speaking platform for themselves, and they're looking for help getting trained as a speaker, a public speaker. That is not what we do. In this particular webinar, what we're going to cover in this webinar is we're going to help you become a spokesperson, meaning speaking on behalf of a company and overall doing excellent media interviews. So the difference here is spokespersons are typically dealing with the media. Speakers are typically engaging with a larger audience or a crowd at any given moment. An interview and spokesperson is usually one-on-one or with a room full of journalists who will then broadcast as a channel your content out to their audience, whether it be print or television. Second on our agenda is what the media wants, what you want, and how to make it all work. And then also we're going to talk about traps to avoid. We're going to give some expert tips and then tell you how to get media training. First of all, your rights and responsibilities. Let's talk through these real quick. First of all, you see this is Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of and founder of Facebook, being interviewed on 60 Minutes, and certainly he's a well-known figure. But I bring him up to talk about what are your rights and responsibilities as someone being interviewed. So let's do that real quick. An interview is an opportunity to to deliver a story to an audience. An interview is not an intellectual exercise, a debate, an argument, an educational exchange, or a friendly chat. It's business. The journalist is there to get their job done, and the reporter's job is to gather, cover, and get a story. Your job is to give the reporter their story. Keep in mind, as we discuss and review these guidelines, these techniques will help you make the most of any interview opportunity. Okay, so your first responsibility is know your story. I always say develop 3 key messages and support each message with specific examples, figures, and third-party endorsements. Use quotable language. In other words, speak in sound bites. This would include using action verbs, full sentences, and positive phrases. Anything you say during an interview can be used later, whether the interview is being recorded or whether the person is just taking notes or if they're even just taking mental notes. So always know that whenever you're with a journal in the company of a journalist, what you say and do can be used in a news story. And I have several examples of CEOs who maybe were doing an informational interview or a dinner with a journalist, and later what the journalist heard inspired them to write a story, and the CEO, for whatever reason, was either embarrassed or a little disappointed that they were so open, or maybe they shared so much information that ultimately the story ended up being about things that they weren't looking to include, or maybe just wasn't part of their key messages. So I always say develop 3 to 5 key messages. I also encourage you to write those 3 to 5 key messages on an index card and keep them handy, whether they're on your desktop, whether they're in your pocket, whether you've got them in your hand. It'll just make you feel more comfortable during the news interview. And if you ever get off track or lose your train of thought, you can always turn to those 3 to 5 key messages during the interview. Actually, when I've given this tip to other CEOs and executives, many of them have come back to me and told me that they actually use this technique for meetings and for presentations, conference calls, and a variety of other things, just to make sure they have those 3 key messages handy with them at all times. I mentioned earlier, use quotable language, such as action verbs, full sentences, and positive phrases. Think of that as a soundbite. When you consume media, when you watch television news or radio news, or even you're reading an article, you'll see the person is quoted, a few times throughout the article, maybe only once even. And you have to understand that that may have come from an hour of interviewing. So what you say during that 1 hour will be edited down or narrowed down. So the more focused you are during that interview, the more focused the article will be, and the more relevant the article will be to the topics and key messages that are important to you. So always be thinking in sound bites. And when you put together your key messages, also be thinking about how those better translate into sound bites. Another thing I recommend is that you say the name of your organization early and often. Don't say it so much that you clearly sound like you're an advertisement or a infomercial, but you want to make sure during the interview, especially an interview that's being recorded for broadcast, whether by radio, podcast, or television, so that when you are quoted, there's an opportunity for your company name or your brand name to appear more than one time during the interview, and even in your own words. The other thing about knowing your story is have a newsworthy theme. Be current, be relevant, know what's going on in the world around you, but also know what's newsworthy and interesting at your company. If you're not sure what newsworthy is, we talk about this on almost each of our webinars, and being newsworthy is basically having one of the 7 elements of news. And so there are several elements of news that are important to know. That includes proximity, meaning how close are you to the audience, conflict, how much conflict is there, and prominence, how prominent are the people involved or the cities involved or the companies involved. So there are several elements of news. Use each question as an opportunity to deliver a message, and specifically your key message. Sometimes a reporter might ask you a question it's irrelevant to your company today, or perhaps off topic for the interview itself. To that end, what I highly recommend to clients is that they take every question as an opportunity to answer it the way they would like to. And you see this a lot in politics, maybe in a political debate or in an interview where, say, presidential candidates or mayoral or governor candidates for governor are being interviewed, and so they might be asked, what is your opinion on some controversial topic, for example, that they're not willing or able or interested in responding to. They'll say, you know what, that's a great question, but what's more important is that voters or Americans or viewers at home focus on, and then they make that transition into one of their key messages. And I would encourage you to do the same. You have the power, if you know your story, you have the power to transition no matter what question was asked of you to another question or to an answer that is more relevant and more appropriate. The reporters or the person interviewing you probably doesn't know nearly as much about your company as you do. And to that end, you have a lot of opportunity to really direct where their curiosity lies and where their information goes towards, or what direction you send their information. So to that end, be discriminating and selective. Don't overload your story. Go in with concise, coherent, and clear set of messages. Lastly, for knowing your story, be confident. You know more about your story than any reporter does, as I said earlier. So be confident going into the interview. The next item under your responsibilities would be consider the audience. Use the reporter as a conduit to your audience. So when you're talking to the reporter, imagine that you're talking to their audience, who is reading their content, who is viewing their television show or their TV news program or even their video cast. Avoid over-involvement with the reporter's attitude. What I mean by that is look past any perceived agenda on the reporter's part that you may perceive or that is real. Okay, you need to stay positive. You need to keep your language clear and simple. Cite and interpret data. Don't expect the reporter to interpret complex ideas or data accurately, or else you'll leave yourself vulnerable to them taking it in the wrong direction or their own direction. Always avoid a debate or dogfight with the journalist. Have examples that the public, the general consumers or average citizens, or perhaps if it's an industry media outlet, that your industry professionals can relate to. I often suggest that you pretend that you're communicating with a family member. Consider the audience and think of them as a family member. You want to be warm and friendly with them, but you also want to help them understand your business or the topic at hand, and don't assume that they're already familiar with your company or your industry, your products or services. The next thing is to develop key messages. As I mentioned earlier, select 3 or 4 positive salient points that will communicate your objective. Commit them to memory and return to them constantly. If you need to, keep them on an index card. Assure the delivery of each of your key messages. They should be simply spoken thoughts rather than well-written, documented comments. Messages should have a cyclical cycle. You should be able to move fluidly through them. Okay? Meaning they should be natural. They shouldn't be forced. They shouldn't be difficult. No message is complete without supportive information. You need real examples, figures, anecdotes, and third-party endorsements. Flag your messages. Before you get into one of your key messages, say the key thing is this. The most important part about it is the 3 most exciting elements are. And later we'll talk briefly about transitional phrases like these. You should revise your messages frequently. They change from publication to news outlet to news outlet. Tailor messages to meet the needs of your audience, as we said before. The other thing you need to be prepared for is push button responses. Anticipate questions that raise issues. Develop a response to put the issues to rest. That means if you know that they're likely to talk about something, prepare ahead of time, much like a presidential debate. Although a media interview is not a debate, certainly you can reasonably anticipate being asked certain questions, and the more prepared you are for those answers, the better off your interview will go. Prepare fast responses to simple questions. When they want to know what is your title and area of responsibility, be prepared for those questions. Know your title, and always be sure to spell your name so that up front, and clarify your title up front so there's no mistakes or misrepresentations later. Prepare simple responses to difficult questions, just like you would the simple questions. How much is the contract worth? What do you do at your company? Who are your customers? Where do you have offices? How many employees do you have? What is your revenue? You may not want to answer some of those questions like what is your revenue, so be prepared with a response that you are comfortable with. Share push button responses with your fellow spokespersons and colleagues and rehearse. We can talk more about that later. Borrow effective push buttons from other colleagues and superiors as well as public relations advisors. The next thing is turn negatives into positives. You have the right and the responsibility to use negative questions as an opportunity to develop positive messages and even your key messages. I encourage you to build bridges from responses to your key messages. In other words, if they ask you about your revenue, say, we really don't want to discuss our revenue, but what we do want to discuss is our growth strategy and how our products are in high demand in these particular markets. Don't repeat negative language. Pause instead and give thoughtful, positive responses. If they say, why is it that your company is currently under investigation? You wouldn't want to respond with, our company is not under investigation. Or you wouldn't want to say, we're really tired of people asking us about that. Instead, just stay very positive and say, and come up with a good response to that question so that you can quickly transition to their next question or transition to one of your key messages. You always want to add some substance to your messages by being specific. You want to demonstrate conviction by sticking with your story. Another responsibility you have is to take control of the interview. After all, this is your story and your opportunity to deliver key messages, and no one knows your story better than you. Show conviction. Use key messages and details to back up your story when and if you're ever challenged. Don't wait for permission to tell your story. Begin communicating as soon as you give your name and title. And constantly advance your story. Move fluidly through your messages and show and stay confident. Now, again, I want to reiterate that most news interviews are not negative. They can raise some controversial points, but generally speaking, when you're asked to give commentary on the industry or a topic that's trending in the news, typically it's the reporter's job to make you look as smart and as credible as possible. And I know a lot of clients are anxious about news interviews and they get worried that they might go wrong. And that's good. You should have a little bit of nervousness and a desire to prepare so that they don't go wrong. But unless your company's in the middle of an investigation or a scandal, most interviews are fairly positive. You should expect to be asked some tough questions, but you shouldn't expect to be surprised or gotcha or set up by sensationalism, unless, of course, you're in the middle of a heated conflict or debate or investigation, and you probably were aware of that possibility in advance to doing the interview. To that end, the last thing I want to advise you of is beware of off the record. There really is no such thing, as I mentioned earlier, of being off the record. Everything is on the record. If you don't want to see a comment become part of a story, or you don't want to be quoted in a certain way, then refrain from saying it altogether. I would also recommend you avoid sarcasm, jokes, and speculation. I once know a CEO who was quoted in a news interview in the lead of a news story of saying that his industry and the people who work in it aren't very sexy. He was referring to the business being pretty basic, not too exciting, but he chose to use the word sexy, and that's what the reporter led with. And ultimately, he was embarrassed by those comments and felt like he was sending the wrong message to his employees when he was basically saying the business was pretty basic and not that exciting. And that was what the reporter ended up leading with. And later, the CEO much regretted referring to his business in that way, because it didn't sell the enthusiasm that he really had for the business, and it somewhat misrepresented the positioning of the company. In addition, if you misspeak, calmly repeat your statement as you would like to have it recorded. And the same is true when the interviewer misspeaks. And so let me explain that for a moment. If you say in an interview, our corporation has 100 employees, and you really meant to say 150 employees, you want to quickly fix that. So if you're in the interview and you go, well, we have 100 employees across the United States, and as you're talking, go, wait a minute, I'm sorry, let me start over. Our company has 150 employees across the United States. And that way you're quickly and immediately addressing and fixing it, so that the viewer at home, if it's a live interview or recorded interview, doesn't misunderstand it, or the reporter doesn't have an opportunity to review their notes and find it wrong in one occurrence and end up using that in the published or broadcast article. The same is true if the interviewer during the interview says, Mr. Johnson, I understand that you employ 100 people across the United States. What are your growth plans for the next few years? When you are asked that question, take the opportunity to say, well, let me just clarify. We have 150 employees, and our current growth plan calls to hire a 10% increase in labor force over the next 5 years. And that's an opportunity for you to calmly repeat your statement as you would like it documented and recorded. And remember, as I said earlier, the interview is taking place from the time you're in the presence of the reporter and until he or she leaves. So if you're doing an interview and you're on a TV set, and maybe you're sitting in a chair waiting for your segment to start, you never know if they have mics on in the studio, or if the lapel mic that you may be wearing is already turned on. And you never know if the sound engineer may have accidentally turned on your mic too early. And so a lot of times the comments that you're making could actually appear live on the screen. I'm going to pull up real quick here a little video to share with us. This is a great example of what not to do during a news interview. Here we go. So Tony doesn't realize he's being recorded on live television. So Tony's basically saying, I have no interest in being part of the local news. Why did you book me on this interview? This is such a waste of my time. I have better things to do. And the reporter is saying, you never know when people are listening to what you're saying. And so right now, Tony is bad mouthing uh, local media, and he's being sarcastic about how excited he is to be on a local news show. And the reporter, and now Tony realizes you heard me. So that's what's called a news blooper. And anyway, that was Tony at his best. You can check that out on YouTube, but it was a pretty embarrassing moment for him. Let's talk about interviewer techniques. All journalists use tactics to perform their tasks. The following descriptions that I'm going to give you should heighten your awareness to the traps of these tactics create. Keep in mind that your objective is to deliver your message well and tell a story, not to constantly evaluate the reporter's style. So one tactic that reporters will use is called machine gunning. That means rapidly firing a series of questions at you. The trap is you're trying to answer all the questions at once and you're not really getting an opportunity to give your best answer. What I recommend you do is choose the question that will allow you to seize control and deliver a message. So for example, you might say, well, why don't I put that into perspective for you? And then go into your key message or go into telling your story. Don't be a victim of the reporter asking so many questions that you lose control and the ability to answer them. Instead, pick one question at a time, answer it well, take a deep breath, and relax. Another tip I want to share with you is that I tell my clients this often. If you're doing a media interview and you feel like you're talking too slow, you're probably talking at just the right pace. If you feel like you're not loud enough, you're probably not. If you feel like you're too loud, you're probably speaking just right. And then if you feel like you don't have enough energy, you're probably right. You need to bring more energy. If you feel like you have enough energy, then you're probably right, or maybe err on a little bit more in energy just to make the interview experience better. But getting back into the interviewer techniques, interrupting. Some journalists will never let you finish a thought or cut you off mid-sentence. Normally that means that they're getting bored with what you're saying, or they're in a hurry, or they're just wanting to move on to another topic and that you've probably given too much information. Remember to speak in sound bites. Try to answer their question in 30 seconds or less. But the trap a reporter will set up is they'll interrupt you. They'll never let you finish a thought or cut you off mid-sentence. And so you want to politely continue with your statement. For example, smile and say, I'll be happy to get to that, but as I was saying, and then finish your previous thoughts. But if that happens, ask yourself if your answers have been long or too technical. Try to be more quotable in that moment. I see that happen a lot, especially with founders, as CEOs who are founders of their company. They are so passionate about their company that they just can't stop talking, and they don't realize that the reporter was only asking you something either out of politeness or to get a 15 to maybe 30-second response, not a 15-minute answer. And so you have to be real careful, and then ask permission if you should continue talking about that or if they had a different question to ask. The other trap you need to be careful of is paraphrasing, putting words into your mouth or trying to seek agreement to the summarized statements. So the trap is you're misquoted or your words have been taken out of context. When that happens, simply restate the summary points in your own words. For example, say, no, that's not quite right. Let me put it this way, and then re-explain it again. Another technique is called dart throwing, where they're attacking you with hostile negative language or pinning negative language on you or the company and your services. The trap is you might react angrily and repeat negative language, missing an opportunity to develop a positive message point. So as a technique, always remain calm, pause before you respond, ignore the attack, and bridge to a message point. For example, say, I think we may be getting off track here. Let's pull back a second and talk about, and then you transition to something more appropriate for what you're there to speak about. Are there any questions at this time? If so, don't hesitate to send your questions in through our webinar. We'd be happy to get those from you. We have people standing by to answer any questions you might have. Speaking of transitions, let me go through a few of them with you. And when we do spokesperson training with your company or with our clients, we spend a lot more time going through this. We'll often train you how to say, that's an interesting question. It reminds me of, and then you go about talking about what's more important to you or more important to the audience of the interviewer in your opinion. And other transitions include saying, before I forget, I want to tell you, or let me put that into perspective. Other transitions are, what's really important to remember here is, what I really want to talk to you about is, let me just add, let me answer that, let me answer you by saying that, let me give you some background information. And that reminds me, one more thing that we need to share with you. Those are some good transitions. The important thing, though, before doing any media interview is certainly to have your key messages already figured out. In fact, the best spokesperson training experiences I've had are when we already know the key messages for the clients and we're prepared to speak to them. Key messages are a whole nother webinar topic all by themselves, but I can tell you that a good key message is always quotable and always makes a good soundbite. But then in addition, there are factoids associated with that key message to support it and make sure that it is very credible if you're ever asked. Media interviewing tips. As we wrap up, I want to share some media interviewing tips. And we already talked about remember your rights, and you can ask the reporter for information that will help you prepare for the interview. You cannot expect the reporter to provide you with all questions in advance. And to be honest, that's typically a pretty rookie mistake or a request that can be made when you're really in the driver's seat of the interview. And what I mean by that is, if you're Bill Gates or if you're a top level CEO, then you can, and you're doing the interview, you can usually call the shots. But if you're looking for the PR and the media interview to be an opportunity to build a name for yourself or your company or to get your message out there, you're going to have to play ball. And part of playing ball is to not have the journalist prepare questions ahead of time or expect them to share those questions with you ahead of time. I'll be honest, most journalists do not prepare their questions ahead of time. They might have a handful of questions that they've prepared specific and uniquely for this interview. And they probably have a handful of questions they ask every interviewee and in every interview that they do. But for the most part, they're looking to have a conversation and build their questions based on the experience they have interviewing with you and the give and take and where the conversation may go. I always encourage you to, and we always ask on behalf of our clients, the following questions before an interview. And that is, what kind of story are you writing? What's the angle? Are you interviewing others for the story? And if so, who are they? And what is your deadline? Those are all very important questions. And you should also ask them, of course, which news outlet they represent and do a little research to understand who their news outlet is and who their audiences are. You want to understand who's reading this and how many people will see it, or who's seeing this interview when it comes to broadcasting. Other interview tips are plan your points and make them early. Early and often repeat your key messages and make sure you have the opportunity to tell your story and tell it well. Okay. Anticipate opposing point of views. There might be somebody being interviewed at the same time or in the same story who has a different point of view than you do, and you might want to think through what those potential differing point of views are up front so that you can address them and so that you can show why you came to your other rationale. Sometimes on a lot of these evening TV show, cable news shows, they will have 6 people at the same time discussing an issue. And so you want to make sure that you clearly communicate your side without appearing defensive, but also to anticipate how someone else might have a differing point of view. I mentioned this earlier, prepare yourself by knowing the media. You'll be more effective if you understand what type of news stories this outlet has done recently, and what their usual positioning is, who they normally talk to, how long are their segments or their interviews, etc. And you also want to know if the article is completely focusing on you, or if you're just going to be quoted one time as one of several sources in the news article. Good journalism typically sources at least three different people in one article, and typically they're from different and non-conflicting organizations or non-connected organizations. Another tip is you don't have to know everything. If a reporter asks questions you can't answer because they're out of your area of expertise or you just don't have that information, don't guess, don't make something up. It's perfectly acceptable for you to say, I'm not an expert or I'm not familiar on that, but I can tell you who is and I will get back to you or I will connect you with them. And to that end, I would never say I don't know. It's just not a legitimate answer. But I would make sure, but do make sure that someone who can answer that question gets back to that reporter in time for his or her deadlines. It's not very helpful for a live broadcast interview, but simply just saying, I'm not familiar with that information. I know who has it, and I can get back to you, on this particular question. And make sure you say, what is your deadline? And then you offer a timeline. So, for example, you might say, you know what, I don't have that information right now, but what I can do is get it for you before 5 p.m. today or before 5 p.m. tomorrow. Will that work for you and your deadline? And then by simply asking that question, that's how you have an opportunity to not only accommodate the needs for that individual, but you're also making yourself appear to be very accommodating and everyone's needs are being met, and you're given some breathing room to make sure you're not speculating incorrectly. The other thing is be brief. The news media presents news in small bites of information, so keep your messages down to a few lines and make your point often. Again, if you're being asked a question, short answers are better than long answers. Use language everyone understands. Every industry has its own jargon, but you should avoid jargon. Some reporters might understand your industry jargon, but the general public may not. So it just makes sense to speak in layman's terms. Use language everyone understands. Be careful to explain abbreviations, and again, avoid jargon. If an untrue statement is made, refute it immediately and politely. So, for example, you might say, or the reporter might say, we know that you've had 5 consecutive negative quarters of financial reporting for your corporation. Tell us what's going on this quarter. And then you might say, well, I'd love to tell you what's going on this quarter, but first let me clarify. We had one negative earnings quarter 2 years ago, and since then, the last several earnings quarters have been all positive. Make sure to correct any statement in an informative and helpful manner. That will help you. And then don't get lost in statistics or numbers. You don't want to come across as boring or robotic during your interview. This kind of information tends to be lengthy and can detract from the ultimate results of your interview. Use numbers sparingly, but most importantly, to underscore your most important points. Any questions? Feel free to tweet us. We'll look forward to responding to them, and also put your tweets in the control panel of your webinar screen. Here's some final tips. Remember that reporters and editors conduct interviews every day. It is not an awkward or special situation for them. It might be special for you, and you might have done more work preparing for the interview than they have, and that's a good thing. But also remember that the reporter has an agenda to get a story and to get it on time. Make your agenda to deliver your key messages clear and concise with a positive attitude. Consider keeping a dealing with the media folder at your desk or near your phone or even on your smartphone, where you have recorded notes from this webinar, as well as maybe your go-to key messages and any other spokesperson training or media protocols within your company. In that folder, you can add more tips and techniques that you hear or articles that you find or tips that we share on our blog or social media in there as well. You need to also always be respectful of reporters and editors and their deadlines. Get back to them as quickly as possible. A lot of times the media will call and they didn't just call you, but they called 5 other people and they only need one person. So whoever gets back to them first wins. So it's kind of a first come, first serve mentality. Journalists are always on deadlines, and so the more responsive you are and the more efficient you are with their time and their inquiries, the better. Ask the reporter some friendly questions when you have the opportunity, such as what subjects do you normally cover? How long have you been with the outlet that you're with? How familiar are you with our company and our industry? Who else are you interviewing? When do you think the story will appear? Now, I have to tell you that when asking when you think the story will appear is such a routine and popular question that I think some journalists get exhausted with it. And you have to keep in mind that they might tell you the story is going to air tonight at 6 or tonight at 11 or next Thursday or this Sunday. And when it doesn't appear, then don't panic because sometimes priorities get changed or deadlines get shifted. I've seen interviews get delayed several months. Our stories get delayed several months, and I've seen other ones get expedited and appear early. The last few tips we have here is always stay friendly. Use disarming techniques like I'm glad you asked that, or that's a good question, even when they ask you something difficult. Defer or refer to other sources if the reporter asks you a question that's beyond your area of knowledge or expertise. And never, ever, 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 ever say no comment because it looks highly unprofessional and is, how do you say, cliche. Speaking of getting trained, I often recommend to clients that they do half day or full day spokesperson training sessions. Sometimes you split that up and you do it all in one day, or sometimes you do 2 half day sessions back to back. I recommend that much of the first day be a review of the things we talked about here. And then I do believe that you should review your spokesperson training on a quarterly or at least semi-annual basis and review and practice. And I often encourage people to practice doing their spokesperson training on camera with a video camera so people can practice their body language and see exactly how they look and sound and feel on camera. I always recommend that be part of the second half of the training. I think that really reinforces what was verbalized during the training experience and really gives an opportunity to hammer that experience and those training components down. If you have more questions, again, tweet them or post them in the question box in your GoToMeeting console, or just contact us through our website. You can actually take a moment and like us on Facebook. But more importantly, I want to take a moment to say thank you to our attendees and give you a bonus offer for participating in today's webinar. Our special today is if you contact us about spokesperson training within the next 24 hours of participating in this webinar, whether you're watching it live or recorded, ask us for our special offer with promo code webinar. With that promo code, we will give you special pricing and a special discount on spokesperson training. Whether we do that spokesperson training at your offices, you come to our offices, we pick a meeting room at a hotel, or we do the spokesperson training, which we're starting to do more of these through video conferencing, either by Skype or a go-to webinar session or a go-to meeting session, or even we're beginning to use our Apple devices and do it through FaceTime, which I think is great. Stay connected with us. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, schedule a free consultation with me. We can talk more about spokesperson training or other PR needs you might have. You can reach our offices at 888-PR-FIRM-8, 888-PR-FIRM-8. I'm at extension 309 and always highly available to you if you do have questions or needs. If you ever find yourself with a PR need, please don't hesitate to reach out to me personally as a resource. Any last questions? Now's the time to give them. Otherwise, you can follow me on Twitter at JasonMudd9 and follow Axia at AxiaPR on Twitter, and we look forward to connecting you with there. Next webinar, we have webinars every single month, but we don't have one planned for next month. So I encourage you to share with us by contacting us which webinar would you like to participate, or which webinar would you like us to have? What topic is important to you? You can also sign up for news and notices about our webinar at axiapr.com/webinar. That's axiapr.com/webinars. Thank you so much for being with us today. I really enjoyed this time and telling you a little bit more about spokesperson training. If you ever have a public relations need, please reach out to us as a resource. We're highly available and we're highly interested and enthusiastic about working with you. Thanks again.